In the spring of 1848, Judge Cornelius Rutledge and his 5 adult sons were found alive but mutilated in their estate outside Beaufort, South Carolina. Each man castrated with surgical precision during a single night. The local newspapers reported a house fire. The medical examiner's report vanished. For 70 years, families who knew the truth never spoke the name of Isaac, the enslaved man who disappeared that same night, leaving behind only a leather journal that would surface decades later in a courthouse basement, revealing a conspiracy of silence that protected not a monster, but something far more disturbing, a community's collective shame. What drove an educated slave to commit an act so calculated, so methodically brutal, that even those who condemned slavery couldn't bring themselves to tell the real story? Before we continue with the story of Isaac and the Rutledge family, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because stories like this, buried in courthouse basements and family secrets, don't tell themselves. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far these dark American secrets travel. The truth about that spring night didn't die with Isaac's disappearance. It festered in the silence of those who witnessed what came before. Beaufort in 1848 stood as one of South Carolina's wealthiest districts. Its prosperity built entirely on Sea Island cotton and the labor of thousands of enslaved people. The town itself occupied a peculiar position in the antebellum South, close enough to Charleston to share its culture of refinement, isolated enough to develop its own particular codes of behavior. Spanish moss hung heavy from the live oaks that lined the streets, and the humid air carried the smell of pluff mud from the surrounding marshlands at low tide. The Rutledge estate, Fair Haven, sprawled across 800 acres 3 miles outside town, where the May River curved through the low country. Judge Cornelius Rutledge had inherited the property from his father and expanded it considerably through shrewd cotton speculation and careful marriages for his sons. At 62, he served as a circuit judge, traveling between Beaufort, Bluffton, and Hilton Head to dispense justice. A man known for harsh sentences and little mercy, particularly in cases involving slaves accused of crimes. The judge cut an imposing figure even in his 6th decade. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that he wore longer than was fashionable, he carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who'd never been meaningfully challenged. His voice, deep and resonant, had pronounced sentences on hundreds of defendants. His hands, large and steady, had signed orders that sent men to the gallows and women to the auction block. Those same hands had also performed medical procedures that no one discussed in polite society, but that had made him quietly wealthy beyond what cotton alone could provide. The judge's 5 sons ranged in age from 28 to 41. The eldest, Cornelius Jr., managed the plantation's operations with an efficiency that matched his father's ruthlessness. At 41, he'd never married, preferring to devote himself entirely to Fair Haven's productivity. He rose before dawn each morning to inspect the fields, checking the work of the overseers, calculating yields down to the pound. The slaves called him Little Judge behind his back, though there was nothing small about his capacity for cruelty. The second son, Thomas, 38, had married into the Drayton family and managed a smaller plantation on nearby St. Helena Island. He visited Fair Haven every Thursday without fail, riding the 7 miles regardless of weather. Thomas had inherited his father's interest in what the judge called medical innovation, and had assisted in many of the procedures performed at Fair Haven. William, 35, lived in Charleston, where he practiced law, specializing in property disputes, particularly those involving slave sales and inheritance. He'd built a reputation for winning cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable, using legal technicalities and intimidation in equal measure. His visits to Fair Haven were less regular than Thomas's, but when he came, he stayed for days, locked in consultation with his father and brothers. The twins, Robert and James, both 28, were the youngest and in some ways the most dangerous of the sons. They'd been raised with a sense of entitlement that bordered on sociopathy. never told no, never denied anything they wanted. They lived at Fairhaven, ostensibly helping Cornelius Jr. manage operations, but in reality spending most of their time hunting, drinking, and terrorizing the enslaved population with impunity. Where their older brothers exercised cruelty with purpose and calculation, the twins inflicted it for entertainment. All five maintained rooms at Fairhaven and gathered there frequently for hunting, business discussions, and what they called their Thursday consultations, private meetings where no slaves or wives were permitted entry. These consultations had been a tradition since the judge's father's time, originally focused on plantation business and political strategy. Under the current judge, they'd evolved into something darker. Isaac occupied a unique position in this world of casual brutality and calculated exploitation. At 36, he served as the plantation's bookkeeper, a role almost unheard of for an enslaved person. His mother, Abigail, had been the judge's father's housekeeper, a woman of remarkable intelligence who had somehow learned to read despite the laws forbidding it. Family legend suggested she'd been taught by a Quaker woman who'd visited the plantation in the 1790s before such visits became impossible. Abigail had been beautiful in her youth, or so the elderly house slaves whispered, and the judge's father had taken notice. Isaac himself bore features that suggested mixed ancestry, though no one ever spoke of it openly. His skin was lighter than most of the field workers, his hair less tightly curled, his features more refined. The judge's father had never acknowledged any relationship, but he'd shown Abigail unusual consideration, allowing her to keep her son close, to work in the house rather than the fields. She'd passed her knowledge to Isaac in secret, teaching him not just reading, but mathematics, grammar, even Latin phrases she'd memorized from overheard conversations. The lessons happened in the darkest hours of morning before the house stirred, with Isaac learning to read by candlelight in his mother's small room. She impressed upon him the danger of what she was doing, the necessity of hiding his abilities except when absolutely necessary. When Abigail died of fever in 1831, young Isaac, then 19, had been devastated. But he'd also demonstrated something that caught Judge Rutledge's attention. While helping sort through his mother's few possessions, Isaac had automatically organized some scattered receipts by date and vendor, his literacy revealing itself in a moment of grief-stricken distraction. The judge could have sold him south as punishment for the illegal education. Instead, he'd seen an opportunity. The plantation's bookkeeper, a white man named Henderson, was stealing from the estate, skimming percentages, falsifying records, growing wealthy on the judge's ignorance of his own accounts. The judge suspected but couldn't prove it without weeks of careful review. He'd given Isaac a test, locked him in the estate office with 3 years of ledgers and told him to find the discrepancies. Isaac, knowing his life might depend on success, had worked for 2 days straight, sleeping on the office floor, eating meals brought by confused house slaves. He'd found every false entry, every inflated expense, every phantom purchase that Henderson had created. More than that, he'd organized his findings in a clear, methodical report that demonstrated not just literacy, but genuine analytical skill. Henderson was dismissed, his thefts exposed. The judge, rather than hire another white bookkeeper who might prove equally dishonest, made a calculated decision. Isaac would maintain the estate ledgers, track cotton yields, manage the quarterly accounts. It saved the cost of hiring a replacement and gave the judge another tool for maintaining power. A slave who could read and write was a slave who could be threatened with teaching others, a crime punishable by death under South Carolina law. Isaac lived in a small room off the main house's back stairs, close enough to be summoned at any hour, isolated enough that the other enslaved people viewed him with suspicion and resentment. The room measured perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a narrow bed, a small desk, and a single window that looked out over the kitchen garden. In winter it was cold, in summer stifling, but it was private, a luxury almost no other slave at Fairhaven possessed. He ate alone, worked alone, spoke little. The house slaves called him the judge's shadow and whispered that he considered himself better than them. The field workers called him worse, a traitor, the master's pet, someone who'd sold his soul for an easy position. None of them knew that Isaac spent his evenings not just maintaining the judge's accounts, but keeping a second set of books that documented horrors they couldn't imagine. Isaac had learned something during his years maintaining the Rutledge accounts, something that burned in him like a slow fire that never dimmed. Numbers told stories that men tried to hide, and the Rutledge ledgers told a story so monstrous that for 8 years Isaac had recorded it in careful columns, waiting, though he hadn't known for what, for some moment when the documentation might matter, when the truth hidden in his numbers might somehow bring consequences to men who seemed beyond all consequence. The spring of 1848 brought unusual tension to Fairhaven. Cotton prices had dropped for the 3rd consecutive year, squeezing profit margins throughout the South. Whispers of abolition from the North grew louder, with increasing talk of dividing the territories gained from Mexico into free versus slave states. The Missouri Compromise seemed increasingly fragile, and men like Judge Rutledge saw their world threatened by forces they couldn't control through judicial rulings or local intimidation. The judge's Thursday consultations became more frequent, sometimes lasting until dawn. Isaac, who slept in the room directly above the study, could hear the raised voices through the floorboards. Sometimes the arguments were about politics, debates over whether South Carolina should threaten secession, whether the slave patrols were sufficient, whether new laws were needed to prevent slave literacy. But other times, the voices dropped to murmurs punctuated by occasional screams that were never explained the next morning. Those screams haunted Isaac's nights. He'd lie awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to sounds that he'd learned meant another woman was undergoing what the judge called his procedure. The screaming never lasted long. Either the woman lost consciousness or was gagged, but it echoed in Isaac's mind long after silence returned to the house below. In his own private journal, hidden in a hollowed Bible in his room, the book's interior carefully carved out to create a space just large enough for a thin leather notebook, Isaac had been keeping his second set of books. While the official Rutledge ledgers showed standard plantation operations in neat columns, Isaac's journal documented something else entirely. Purchase records for chemicals from Charleston, carbolic acid, laudanum, chloroform. Shipping receipts for medical instruments, forceps, scalpels, speculums, surgical thread. Bills from medical supply companies in Baltimore and Philadelphia, carefully marked as educational materials in the official ledgers, but detailed precisely in Isaac's hidden record. Most damning of all, a list of names with dates beside them. Sally Pickens, age 14, May 1840. Jesse Cunningham, age 16, August 1841. Clara Simmons, age 13, March 1842. The list went on, growing longer each year. 26 names in total, each followed by a date and a single word that appeared again and again. Procedure. Isaac had known some of these women. Sally had worked in the kitchen before she was taken to the study one Thursday evening, and returned days later, pale and fevered, barely able to walk. She died 2 weeks after that, buried in the slave cemetery without ceremony or explanation. Jessie had survived, but was never the same. She moved like someone whose insides had been damaged beyond repair, walking carefully, constantly in pain. Clara had been sold to a plantation in Georgia less than a month after her procedure, separated from her mother and younger siblings without warning. For 8 years, Isaac had documented it all while maintaining perfect discipline in his public demeanor, showing no hint of the rage and horror that consumed him privately. He performed his duties flawlessly, spoke when spoken to, kept the judge's accounts with meticulous accuracy. And every night, he updated his journal, recording evidence that he had no clear idea how to use but felt compelled to preserve, as though the act of documentation was itself a form of resistance, a way of insisting that these crimes had witnesses, even if they had no consequences. On the evening of May 4th, 1848, all 5 Rutledge sons gathered at Fairhaven for what the judge announced would be an important Thursday consultation. Isaac served supper that night, a duty that fell to him when the family wanted complete privacy from other house slaves. As he set out the dishes of roasted duck, rice pilaf, and early spring vegetables, he noticed something different in the usual atmosphere. The sons normally arrived boisterous, full of talk about hunting or politics or business. Tonight, they were subdued, glancing at their father with something that looked almost like nervousness. The judge himself ate mechanically, his jaw tight, responding to his son's attempts at conversation with curt, single words. Isaac moved around the table silently, refilling wine glasses, removing dishes, his presence so familiar after years of service that the men barely registered his existence. He'd perfected the art of being simultaneously present and invisible, there but not there. A servant whose discretion was so absolute that secrets could be discussed in front of him without concern. As he brought out the dessert course, a blackberry pie made with berries from the plantation's own bushes, he heard fragments of conversation that made his hands tremble slightly. Thomas was saying something about complications with the last one, and maybe we should reconsider the broader implementation. William mentioned legal risks, something about if word ever got out to certain parties in Charleston. The twins, typically boisterous, sat quiet and tense. Judge Rutledge cut them all off with a sharp gesture. "We'll discuss it properly afterward," he said, his voice carrying the tone that indicated the subject was closed. "Isaac, bring coffee to the study at 9 o'clock sharp, then retire to your quarters. We're not to be disturbed under any circumstances." Isaac nodded, his face perfectly neutral, and began clearing the dessert plates. But his mind was racing. Over the years, he'd learned to read the patterns of these consultations. When the judge ordered complete privacy and looked this tense, it meant something significant was being planned. And given the fragments he'd overheard, it involved expanding the procedures he'd been documenting. 2 hours earlier, while the family was still preparing for dinner, Isaac had made a decision that had been building for 8 years. He'd gone to the judge's medicine cabinet, kept locked, but Isaac had learned to pick simple locks years ago, and carefully extracted a substantial amount of laudanum. Not enough that its absence would be noticed immediately, but more than enough for his purposes. He'd added it to the whiskey decanter in the study, the special bottle that the judge opened only for his Thursday consultations. The laudanum would mix seamlessly with the whiskey's strong flavor, undetectable to men who expected their alcohol to have a bitter edge. Isaac had calculated the dosage carefully, using knowledge gained from years of observing the judge's medical supplies. Not enough to kill. Death was not what he wanted, but enough to ensure deep, immobile sleep that would last for hours. The house settled into its evening sounds as Isaac cleared the dinner service and carried dishes to the kitchen house. Crickets singing through the open windows, the distant call of a whippoorwill from the marshlands, the creak of old oak boards as the structure cooled in the night air. From the study below his room, he heard the scrape of chairs being positioned, the clink of glasses, the low rumble of male voices preparing for serious discussion. Isaac climbed to his room and sat on his narrow bed, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Everything he'd prepared over the past months was ready. Hidden in a canvas bag under his bed were the instruments he'd gathered. A straight razor, stropped to perfect sharpness on a leather strap he'd stolen from the barber in town. Clean cloths torn from an old sheet. A bottle of carbolic acid, obtained through a forged note to a Charleston chemist. Isaac had practiced the judge's signature for weeks until he could replicate it perfectly. Surgical thread, stolen from the same medical supply company that had sold instruments to the judge. Taken one spool at a time over several months, so its absence would never be noticed. He waited, counting the minutes, imagining what was happening in the study below. The men would be pouring whiskey, settling into their discussion, whatever dark plan they'd gathered to finalize. They'd drink deeply. They always did during these consultations, their inhibitions loosening as they discussed things that would horrify anyone outside their circle. The laudanum would take perhaps 30 to 40 minutes to work fully, depending on how much food remained in their stomachs, how quickly they drank. At 9 o'clock, Isaac descended with the coffee service, a silver tray carrying a pot and 7 cups. He knocked twice on the study door and entered without waiting for a response, as was his long-established custom. The 6 men sat around the judge's large mahogany desk, papers spread before them, speaking in low tones that stopped abruptly when Isaac entered. The judge looked up, and Isaac noticed immediately that his eyes were slightly unfocused, his movements a fraction slower than usual. "Leave it," the judge said, his words carrying the faint thickness that indicated significant alcohol consumption. "Go to bed. We'll be here late and don't wish to be disturbed." Isaac set down the tray and withdrew, closing the heavy door behind him. He climbed the back stairs to his room, retrieved his canvas bag, and then descended to the kitchen house, a separate structure 30 feet from the main house, where the cooking was done to keep fire risk and summer heat away from the living quarters. The kitchen was empty at this hour. The fire banked low, the house slaves long since retired to their quarters. Isaac spread his instruments on the kitchen's scrubbed wooden table and waited, every nerve alert, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was awake and moving. The quarters where the house slaves slept were quiet. The distant cabins of the field workers showed no lights. The night insects sang their endless songs, and somewhere in the marshlands, a great horned owl called its hunting cry. He waited 2 full hours, ensuring that the laudanum had done its work completely. Around 11 o'clock, he carefully made his way back to the main house, carrying his canvas bag and a lamp turned low. His hands were perfectly steady now, his mind crystalline clear. Fear had burned away, leaving only purpose. The study door opened silently on well-oiled hinges. Inside, the scene confirmed what Isaac had planned for. All 6 men had collapsed into unconsciousness. Judge Rutledge lay slumped over his desk, one arm stretched across the papers they'd been reviewing, snoring heavily. Cornelius Jr. had his head thrown back in his leather chair, mouth open, spittle on his chin. Thomas had slid sideways, held upright only by the chair's arms. William sprawled forward with his face pressed against the desk. The twins had collapsed in identical positions, sitting upright but with their heads lolled to the side, like puppets with cut strings. Isaac stood for a moment in the doorway, taking in the sight. These men, so powerful in their wakeful hours, looked pathetic in their drugged sleep. And yet even now, even helpless, they represented a system of power so absolute that what Isaac was about to do would be considered the ultimate crime. Worse than murder, because it struck at the very foundation of their authority. He closed and locked the study door from inside, then turned up his lamp. What he did over the next 4 hours, he did methodically, with the precision of someone who had studied anatomical drawings in the judge's own medical books, the same books the judge consulted when perfecting his procedures on enslaved women. Isaac worked on Judge Rutledge first, the architect of all this suffering. He carefully moved the papers aside, positioned the unconscious man properly, and then proceeded with movements that he'd mentally rehearsed hundreds of times. He used the judge's own instruments, the ones kept in a locked cabinet. Isaac had learned that lock's secrets months ago. He followed techniques he'd seen described in the medical journals the judge kept in his library, the ones that detailed surgical methods for what they euphemistically called population control measures. The judge stirred once, mumbling incoherently, but the laudanum kept him under. Isaac worked without hurry, using the carbolic acid to clean each wound the way the medical texts recommended for preventing infection. He sutured where necessary, applied pressure to stop bleeding, worked with the care of someone who wanted his subjects to survive and remember. He moved from man to man, carrying his lamp, adjusting its position for better light. Cornelius Jr., Thomas, William. Each received the same meticulous attention, the same precise application of techniques they'd helped develop and apply to women who'd had no choice, no warning, no mercy. The twins, Robert and James, he left for last. They'd been present for fewer of the procedures than their older brothers, their involvement more recent, but they'd participated with enthusiasm that had sickened Isaac when he observed it. Their youth and vigor would help them heal, he reasoned. They'd have decades to live with what had been done to them. Through it all, the house remained silent, except for the occasional snore from his unconscious patients. Isaac's hands stayed steady, his breathing even. He felt no joy in what he was doing, no satisfaction. This was justice, not revenge, a distinction he knew others might not appreciate, but that mattered to him absolutely. He was giving these men a measure of what they'd inflicted on others, using their own methods, their own justifications about medical necessity and population control. When he'd finished with all 6 men, Isaac cleaned his instruments thoroughly and packed them in his canvas bag. He washed his hands in the kitchen house, watching blood swirl pink in the basin before pouring the water into the garden. He changed into clean clothes, a simple homespun shirt and trousers he'd set aside weeks ago. Then he went to his room one final time and retrieved his hollowed Bible, the one containing his journal with its 8 years of documentation. He took nothing else. No extra clothes, no food, no money. He had none anyway. Just the journal, the instruments, and the clothes on his back. As he descended the back stairs for the last time, the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, that deep blue that comes before dawn. In perhaps an hour, the house slaves would begin stirring. In 2 hours, someone would try to wake the men in the study and discover what had been done. Isaac walked across the kitchen garden, past the smokehouse and the dairy, along the path that led to the quarters where the field workers lived. He didn't look back at the house. At the edge of the cotton fields, where the cultivated land gave way to forest, he paused only long enough to take 3 deep breaths of the cool morning air. Then he disappeared into the pine woods that stretched toward the Savannah River, and into a freedom he'd purchased, with an act so calculated and terrible that 70 years would pass before anyone would speak publicly about what truly happened at Fairhaven on the night of May 4th, 1848. The screaming started around 7 that morning. A house slave named Martha, arriving to light the fires and prepare breakfast, found the study door locked from inside. When repeated knocking produced only groans and incoherent sounds, she called for help. 2 field hands broke down the door and found a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. 6 grown men, conscious now but in states ranging from confusion to agony, each bearing identical mutilations. Blood soaked through their clothing despite Isaac's careful suturing. Some were crying, some were screaming. Judge Rutledge, awake but still affected by laudanum, kept repeating what happened, as though his mind couldn't accept what his body told him. The plantation erupted into chaos. Overseers were summoned. House slaves ran in all directions, some to fetch the local doctor, others simply fleeing the horror they'd glimpsed through the study door. The field workers, hearing fragments of what had occurred, reacted with a mixture of shock and something else. Something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction to the white overseers who noticed it. Dr. Thaddeus Crenshaw arrived within the hour, took one look at the scene, and immediately sent a rider to Charleston for assistance. He worked frantically to stabilize the men, administering laudanum for pain, checking for signs of infection, trying to understand how such injuries could have been inflicted so precisely. When he asked what had happened, the men couldn't or wouldn't say. The laudanum had erased their memories of the evening, and they recalled nothing between starting their consultation and waking in agony. It wasn't until late morning, when the household had been searched and all slaves accounted for except one, that someone thought to check Isaac's room. They found it empty of personal effects, the bed made with military precision, everything clean and ordered. But Martha, searching more carefully, found something that had been left deliberately visible on the small desk. A piece of paper with a list of 26 names, each followed by dates, and at the bottom, a single sentence in Isaac's precise handwriting. You made them unable to bear children. Now, you share their fate. When this note was shown to Judge Rutledge, something in his face changed. Even through the haze of pain and drugs, understanding dawned, and with it came something the house slaves present would later describe as fear. The first time any of them had ever seen that expression on the judge's face. He ordered the note destroyed immediately, burned to ash, and forbade anyone from speaking of it. Then he called for Dr. Crenshaw and whispered something in the doctor's ear that made the physician's face go pale. The immediate aftermath of May 5th, 1848, brought a frenzy of activity that revealed the Rutledge family's true power in the Low Country. Within hours of the discovery, slave patrols were mobilized throughout Beaufort County and beyond. Riders carried notices to Savannah, Charleston, Columbia, even as far as Wilmington. Descriptions of Isaac, emphasizing his education, his ability to read and write, the danger he posed as a literate runaway with intimate knowledge of plantation operations. The posted reward was extraordinary. $1,000 for his capture alive, $500 if proof of his death could be provided. In 1848, that sum represented more than most farmers earned in 2 years, more than enough to motivate bounty hunters throughout the region. The notices appeared on courthouse doors, in tavern common rooms, at crossroads and ferry landings. Every ship leaving Port Royal was searched. Every wagon heading north was stopped and inspected. But Isaac had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. The bloodhounds brought to track him lost his scent at the Savannah River, suggesting he'd taken to the water. But whether he'd drowned, been picked up by a boat, or simply waded along the shallows to confuse the dogs, no one could determine. Some claimed they'd spotted a man matching his description on the road to Charleston, others in the opposite direction toward Savannah. The sightings continued for weeks, always contradictory, never confirmed. What became clear was that someone, perhaps multiple people, had helped him. A runaway slave rarely got far without assistance, and a slave carrying a canvas bag of surgical instruments would have been conspicuous. Yet Isaac had disappeared so thoroughly that even the professional slave catchers, men who made their living tracking runaways, found no trace. The speculation continued for months, filling the vacuum of official information. Some said he'd made it to the Underground Railroad, that network of safe houses and sympathetic allies that moved, escaped slaves north. Others claimed he'd drowned trying to cross the Savannah River. Still others whispered that he'd been killed by other slaves who feared the retribution his crime would bring upon them all, a theory that held particular currency among slaveholders eager to believe their chattels remained loyal despite all evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, at Fairhaven, a different kind of crisis unfolded behind closed doors. Dr. Crenshaw had been joined by 2 colleagues from Charleston, Dr. Robert Dillingham, a surgeon with military experience, and Dr. Howard Finch, who specialized in treating wealthy planters. The 3 physicians worked to save lives that were not actually in danger. Isaac's careful technique had ensured survival, but they struggled with complications that emerged as the men began to heal. Infections developed despite the carbolic acid Isaac had used. Thomas developed a fever that lasted for days and left him weakened. William suffered from severe pain that laudanum barely touched. The twins, younger and stronger, healed faster but grappled with the psychological trauma of understanding what had been done to them. Cornelius Jr. refused to speak to anyone, lying in his room staring at the ceiling. Judge Rutledge himself presented the strangest case. His physical wounds healed adequately, but his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He'd wake screaming from nightmares, calling out names, Sally, Jessie, Clara, others from Isaac's list. In his delirium, he'd confess fragments of what he'd done, describing procedures in clinical detail that horrified the nurses attending him. Dr. Crenshaw administered increasing doses of laudanum to keep him quiet, fearing what he might say in front of the wrong ears. It was during one of the judge's delirious episodes that Dr. Crenshaw discovered the full scope of what had been happening at Fairhaven. The judge, barely conscious, mistook Crenshaw for his father and began apologizing for not perfecting the technique, for losing subjects to infection, for the failures that had held back the program's expansion. He spoke of plans to train other physicians, of establishing a systematic approach to preventing slave reproduction across multiple plantations, of turning medical experimentation into standardized practice. Crenshaw, listening with growing horror, realized he was hearing a confession to crimes that went far beyond even what Isaac's note had suggested. This hadn't been isolated cruelty, but a deliberate program, documented and refined over years, with ambitions to expand across the region. The physician faced an immediate crisis of conscience compounded by self-interest. His own plantation had been struggling with what he considered excessive slave births, children who consumed resources for years before becoming productive workers. He'd purchased Judge Rutledge's services twice, paying handsomely for procedures on 2 young women who'd been too fertile. Those women had survived, but would bear no children, exactly as Crenshaw had wanted. Now he understood that his participation, even as a client rather than practitioner, made him complicit in something monstrous. And he wasn't alone. As he quietly investigated over the following days, consulting with Dillingham and Finch, he discovered that at least 8 other plantation owners in the region had purchased similar services from the judge. They'd all maintained silence, treating it as a private business transaction, never discussing it openly. The 3 physicians met in secret on May 15th, 11 days after the attack. They gathered in Crenshaw's study in Beaufort Town, away from Fairhaven's tainted walls, and confronted an impossible situation. They'd found Isaac's hidden journal, discovered by a house slave cleaning his room and turned over to them. The journal documented everything. 62 procedures over 8 years, 12 deaths from complications, payments received from other plantation owners, even correspondence discussing plans for expansion. Dr. Finch argued for full disclosure. The crimes were too severe to ignore, and Isaac's actions, while illegal and brutal, had been provoked by genuine atrocities. Exposing the truth might at least prevent future horrors. Dr. Dillingham argued the opposite. Disclosure would destroy numerous prominent families, himself included. He'd also purchased the judge's services. It would create a scandal that could reach beyond South Carolina, potentially emboldening abolitionists who were always seeking evidence of slavery's horrors. The social order depended on maintaining certain silences. Dr. Crenshaw, as the senior physician and most respected of the 3, ultimately made the decision that would shape how this story was told for 70 years. He proposed a compromise that protected everyone except the truth. They would report that a trusted slave had gone mad, perhaps from reading materials he shouldn't have accessed, which had confused his simple mind. In his insanity, he'd attacked the family and fled. The details of the attack would remain vague, described only as serious injuries that had necessitated extensive medical treatment. The judge's experimental work would be completely concealed, his medical journals destroyed, his correspondence with other physicians burned. To seal this conspiracy of silence, they composed a letter documenting their decision and their reasons, then locked it away with instructions that it not be opened for 50 years. This letter, they believed, would protect them if questions arose later, while also preserving some record of the truth for history to eventually judge. The 3 physicians signed the letter on May 18, 1848. It was witnessed by 2 lawyers who'd been brought into the conspiracy, men who also had reasons to want the truth suppressed. Then they set about implementing their cover-up with the same methodical precision that the judge had once applied to his experiments. Judge Rutledge's medical equipment was collected and destroyed, smashed into pieces and buried in a pit that was then covered with quicklime. His journals, detailed records of every procedure, every subject, every outcome, were burned in Crenshaw's fireplace, the 3 physicians watching to ensure every page was consumed. The correspondence with other physicians was tracked down and similarly destroyed. Isaac's journal, the evidence that could have vindicated his actions to some degree, was burned last, though not before Crenshaw made careful notes of the names listed within. The women whose names appeared in that journal presented a different problem. They were living evidence, scattered across Fairhaven and neighboring plantations, able to testify if anyone thought to ask them. The solution was brutal in its efficiency. All 26 who'd survived the procedures were quietly sold over the following months, sent to plantations in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Families were broken apart. Children were separated from mothers. The women disappeared into the vast machinery of the internal slave trade, scattered so thoroughly that their stories could never be gathered, their testimony never coordinated. The official story released to newspapers was brief and carefully worded. The Charleston Courier ran 3 sentences on May 20th. A trusted Negro belonging to Judge C. Rutledge of Beaufort became deranged and attacked members of the family before absconding. The judge and his sons sustained injuries but are recovering under medical care. Authorities are searching for the fugitive, who is considered dangerous due to his unsettled mental state. The Beaufort Tribune, more locally focused, provided slightly more detail while still maintaining the fiction. Judge Rutledge's Negro bookkeeper, a slave named Isaac of approximately 36 years, perpetrated a vicious assault on Thursday last before fleeing the Rutledge estate. The judge and his 5 sons are recuperating from their injuries. Citizens are warned that the fugitive, who possesses the unusual ability to read and write, should be considered extremely dangerous. Anyone with information regarding his whereabouts should contact the authorities immediately. No newspaper mentioned the nature of the injuries. No report detailed what might have provoked such an attack. The silence was enforced through a combination of social pressure, legal threats, and the slaveholding class's collective understanding that certain things, once spoken aloud, could never be unspoken. Within Beaufort's enslaved community, however, a different story circulated. Whispered in the quarters after the overseers had retired, passed along the networks that connected plantations throughout the Low Country, the truth emerged in fragments. Isaac had done something to the men who'd hurt so many women. He'd used the master's own methods against them. He'd made them understand in flesh and blood what they'd inflicted on others. The reaction in the quarters was complex and divided. Some viewed Isaac as a hero, a man who'd struck back against unbearable cruelty. Others feared what his actions might bring down upon them all: increased restrictions, harsher punishments, closer surveillance. Still others simply didn't know what to think about violence that seemed both justified and horrifying, necessary and unforgivable. One elderly woman, a slave at a plantation neighboring Fairhaven, was later quoted by an abolitionist who visited the region in disguise. She'd said something that captured the moral complexity. What Isaac done was terrible. But what was done to those girls, that was terrible too. Sometimes terrible is all that's left when mercy has been beaten out of the world. Don't make it right, though. Just makes it real. The Rutledge family's recovery, physical if not psychological, took the better part of a year. Judge Rutledge never returned to the bench. He'd submit his resignation in August 1848, citing health concerns, and retreated entirely to Fairhaven, where he'd spend his remaining years in near isolation. The man who'd once dominated courtrooms and social gatherings became almost reclusive, rarely leaving the estate, speaking to few visitors. His sons dispersed, each coping with trauma in different ways. Cornelius Jr. attempted to maintain the plantation's operations, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Cotton yields declined. Discipline among the slaves loosened, not from kindness, but from inattention. The overseers, sensing the vacuum of authority, became either too harsh or too lax, and the plantation's efficiency suffered accordingly. Thomas abandoned his own plantation on St. Helena Island and moved back to Fairhaven, unable to manage his affairs independently. He developed what a modern physician might recognize as symptoms of severe depression: listlessness, inability to focus, frequent crying spells. He'd spend hours sitting on the veranda, staring toward the river, rarely speaking. William maintained his Charleston law practice, but his reputation suffered from rumors about illness and family troubles. Clients began taking their business elsewhere. By 1850, he'd closed his practice and retreated to drink and bitterness. The twins, Robert and James, reacted with rage that bordered on madness. They'd ride out with slave patrols at every opportunity, treating every captured runaway with brutal violence, as though punishing all enslaved people for Isaac's specific crime. The cruelty became so notorious that even other slaveholders commented on it, though none intervened. In 1852, Robert was killed when a runaway he was pursuing turned and fought back. James survived but lost the will to continue, sinking into the same depression that had claimed Thomas. The plantation itself began to decay. Paint peeled from the main house. The cotton fields, once pristine, developed patches of weeds. Repairs went unmade. The enslaved workers, sensing the family's weakness, worked slower, took unauthorized breaks, engaged in small resistances that would have brought swift punishment in earlier years, but now went largely unnoticed. Beaufort society watched this decline with discomfort. The Rutledges had been pillars of the community, their fall raising uncomfortable questions. Some attributed it to bad luck, others to the trauma of the attack. But the more perceptive understood that the family was carrying some burden beyond physical injury, a shame or guilt that was eating them from inside. Then, in November 1849, 18 months after Isaac's disappearance, something happened that reignited speculation about the case and suggested Isaac hadn't simply vanished into death or distant freedom. A package arrived at the offices of the Charleston Mercury, one of the region's most prominent newspapers. It contained no return address, but the postmark indicated it had been mailed from Philadelphia. Inside was a sheaf of papers, careful copies of pages from Judge Rutledge's medical journals, reproduced in Isaac's precise handwriting. The documents detailed 43 separate procedures performed between 1840 and 1847, complete with the enslaved women's names, ages, the dates of the operations, and clinical notes about outcomes. The copies included the judge's own assessments of what had worked versus what had led to complications, a euphemism for deaths or permanent injuries. Attached to these documents was a cover letter, also in Isaac's handwriting, that would become one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the case. It read, "To the editor of the Charleston Mercury, I write to you from freedom, that state which I obtained through actions I do not regret, though I recognize their gravity. I did not flee from justice, but toward it, toward a justice that the courts of South Carolina could never provide to enslaved people suffering atrocities at the hands of those meant to uphold law. Judge Cornelius Rutledge, under the guise of medical innovation, performed experimental surgeries on enslaved women for 8 years. These procedures, designed to prevent childbearing, were conducted without consent, often resulting in death or permanent injury. The judge charged other plantation owners for these services, profiting from suffering while presenting himself as a man of science and justice. I documented these crimes for years, maintaining records as precise as those I kept for the plantation's legitimate business. On May 4, 1848, I acted to ensure that Judge Rutledge and his sons, who assisted in many of these procedures, would create no more victims. I used their own techniques, their own instruments, their own justifications about medical necessity. I gave them mercy they never showed. I let them live, though they must live now with understanding, in their own bodies, what they inflicted upon others. I include copies of the judge's records so that history, if not the present, might know the truth. I do not expect sympathy or pardon. I do not claim my actions were lawful, but I do assert they were necessary and just within a system where law itself had become a tool of oppression rather than protection. I call what I did justice. Future generations may call it vengeance. Both would be right. Both would be wrong. There are no right words for what happens when evil reaches a point where silence becomes complicity. You will not publish this letter or these documents. I know the world we live in, the powers that maintain it, but I send them nonetheless, so that someone somewhere might know that these women suffered, that their suffering was documented, and that it did not go entirely without consequence. I remain in freedom and conscience, Isaac." The letter's prediction proved accurate. Harrison Pettigrew, the Mercury's editor, read the documents with growing horror and immediately understood their explosive nature. These weren't vague allegations, but specific, detailed accusations backed by what appeared to be authentic medical records. If published, they would create a scandal that could reach far beyond South Carolina, providing abolitionists with exactly the kind of documented atrocity they'd long claimed existed, but rarely could prove. Pettigrew called in Dr. Crenshaw, showing him the documents and asking for verification. Crenshaw examined them and confirmed they were authentic copies of the judge's records that were supposed to have been destroyed completely. Somehow Isaac had made copies before his flight, or perhaps he'd had them hidden elsewhere all along, insurance against some future need. The physician begged Pettigrew not to publish. He explained the conspiracy of silence, acknowledged his own complicity, and painted a dire picture of what publication would mean. Families destroyed, social order destabilized, racial tensions inflamed, potential violence against innocent people caught in the resulting chaos. Pettigrew struggled with the decision for days. As a journalist, he believed in truth and the public's right to know. As a South Carolinian and slaveholder himself, he understood the forces arguing for silence. The compromise he reached would later be seen as either wisdom or cowardice, depending on the judge's perspective. He locked the documents in his personal safe and never published them, but he also never destroyed them, keeping them as evidence that the crimes detailed in Isaac's letter were real and documented. He told Dr. Crenshaw about his decision, extracting a promise that the physician would similarly preserve his 1848 letter, so that someday, somehow, the truth might emerge even if the present couldn't handle it. When Pettigrew died in 1869, his daughter found the documents while settling his affairs. She read them without fully understanding their significance. They seemed to be medical records with a disturbing letter attached, but the context was missing. Not knowing what else to do with them, she donated them to the Charleston Historical Society as part of her father's papers, where they were filed away, catalogued vaguely as Correspondence Medical Matters, 1849. They would remain there, unexamined, for more than 50 years. Meanwhile, Isaac's trail had indeed gone cold, but not in the way authorities believed. He hadn't drowned in the Savannah River, hadn't been killed by bounty hunters or captured and returned to slavery. Instead, he'd made it north through a combination of careful planning, extraordinary luck, and help from sources that would never be fully documented. The Underground Railroad had many routes and many conductors, some known to history and many forever anonymous. Isaac's escape was aided by a Quaker family in Savannah who ran a legitimate shipping business, but also secretly moved runaways north on their merchant vessels. He'd made contact with them through connections established years earlier. His mother had mentioned their names before her death, part of knowledge passed quietly through the enslaved community for those who might someday need it. He'd traveled hidden in a ship's cargo hold for 11 days, landing in Philadelphia in June 1848. From there, he'd made his way to a community of free black people in the city's 7th Ward, where his education and skills made him valuable despite his fugitive status. He found work as a bookkeeper for a black-owned business, using a different name, keeping his past carefully concealed. But Isaac had not fled simply to save himself. Over the following years, he became quietly involved in abolitionist work, though always behind the scenes, never in public where his face might be recognized by a Southern traveler or bounty hunter. He used his education to help other fugitives, teaching them to read, helping them forge free papers, managing accounts for organizations that aided runaways. He also began a private mission that would consume decades, tracking down the women whose names appeared in his journal, the ones who'd been sold south after his flight. It was slow, dangerous work, requiring careful inquiries through networks of free black people, sympathetic whites, and the enslaved community itself. Letters went back and forth, coded messages passed through trusted intermediaries, patient investigation across years. By 1855, Isaac had located 17 of the 26 women from his list. Some had died, Sally from infection, 3 others from various causes related to their injuries. But 13 still lived, scattered across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi plantations. Isaac began sending them money, small amounts at first, carefully funneled through intermediaries so it couldn't be traced back to him. Just a few dollars here and there, enough to purchase small comforts, occasionally to buy their freedom when circumstances allowed. One of these women was Clara Simmons, whose story would later prove crucial to the historical record. Clara had been sold to a plantation outside Savannah after the procedures at Fairhaven. She'd survived, adapted, lived with her injury in silence like so many others. When money began arriving, unexplained, anonymous, she'd first been frightened, then confused, then gradually accepting that somehow someone cared about what had happened to her. In 1853, Clara was interviewed by a Northern abolitionist visiting Georgia, a Quaker woman named Patience Hathaway, who traveled the South documenting enslaved people's experiences. Hathaway kept detailed journals of these interviews, carefully hidden and not published until 1891, long after the Civil War had made such testimony safer to share publicly. Clara's account to Hathaway was one of 37 testimonies the Quaker woman collected, but it stood out for its specific detail about medical experimentation. Clara described being taken to Fairhaven at age 13, brought into a room where several white men waited, held down despite her struggles and screams, subjected to a procedure she didn't understand, but that caused agony beyond anything she'd experienced. She spoke of waking days later, in quarters she didn't recognize, of pain that lasted for months, of eventually understanding that she would never bear children. "They told us it was for our own good," Clara said, according to Hathaway's journal. "Master said we wasn't fit to raise children, that they was saving us from that burden. But I wanted children, wanted them powerful. I used to dream about having a baby, holding it, teaching it things. They took that dream away with their knives and their medicine bottles, and their talk about science. When I heard what Isaac done to them, heard it from another girl who'd come from Beaufort Way, I cried for 2 days, not from being sad, but from something like hope. Maybe justice was possible even in this world. Maybe someone cared enough about what happened to us to make them pay something, even if it couldn't never balance what they took." Hathaway's journals also recorded something else. Clara mentioned receiving mysterious gifts of money, never explained, that had eventually allowed her to purchase her freedom in 1856. She attributed it to someone who knew what happened at Fairhaven, someone who never forgot us even after he got away. The Civil War should have ended the story, sweeping away the antebellum world and its secrets with it. Beaufort fell to Union forces in November 1861, one of the earliest southern cities captured by the North. Fairhaven became a field hospital, with federal surgeons operating in the same study where Judge Rutledge had performed his experiments 20 years earlier. The irony was lost on the soldiers who slept there, unaware of the room's history. Judge Rutledge himself died in 1851, never having recovered his mental faculties, never having spoken publicly about what drove Isaac to his act of calculated vengeance. His sons scattered in the war's aftermath. Cornelius Jr. died of disease in 1863. Thomas survived the war but moved to Texas, dying there in poverty in 1871. William succumbed to drink in 1867. Of the twins, James outlived them all, dying in 1883 in a veterans' home in Virginia, his mind damaged by what later physicians would call melancholia, an inability to escape depression that had roots in trauma decades old. Fairhaven itself, stripped of its enslaved workforce and unable to function as a plantation, changed hands repeatedly after the war. It became a boarding house briefly, then stood empty for years. The house decayed, the fields grew wild, and the property became associated with bad luck and misfortune among the local freed people. They'd tell their children to stay away from the old Rutledge place, not because of ghosts, but because of history, memories of what had happened there that still felt too raw to approach casually. In 1877, during the tumultuous end of Reconstruction, something occurred that suggested Isaac not only had survived, but had prospered in freedom. A well-dressed black man, perhaps in his 60s, appeared in Beaufort asking questions about the Rutledge family. He spoke with an accent that suggested years spent in New England or perhaps Canada. The sharp consonants of educated northern speech rather than the softness of the low country. He visited Fairhaven, standing before the decaying house for a long time, his expression unreadable. He went to the courthouse and requested access to records from 1848, reading through them methodically while the clerk watched nervously. He walked through the old slave cemetery at Fairhaven, pausing at certain unmarked graves as though he knew who lay beneath them. The courthouse clerk, a man named Gerald Hempstead, who'd been a child in 1848, recognized something in the visitor's bearing, the way he moved, the precision of his questions. Years later, Hempstead wrote to a friend, "I cannot be certain it was Isaac. I was only 6 when he disappeared, and memory is unreliable across decades. But something about him stirred old stories my father told. Stories, he said, were not to be repeated." The visitor asked specifically about what became of the Rutledge sons, about whether the judge's medical equipment had ever been found, about whether certain women had been sold south in 1848 and 1849. Questions that an ordinary visitor would have no reason to ask, but that the Isaac from the old stories would care about deeply. The visitor stayed in Beaufort 3 days, boarding at a hotel that catered to the few black travelers who could afford it. He was polite, quiet, asked permission before entering spaces, paid his bills promptly. On the morning of his departure, he left a donation with the newly established school for black children, $1,000, an enormous sum that would fund the school's operations for 2 years. The donation came with specific instructions. The school should teach not just reading and basic arithmetic, but also bookkeeping, accounting, and how to maintain records. "Let them learn," he wrote in the accompanying letter, "to read the true story hidden in numbers. Let them understand that documentation itself can be resistance, that bearing witness has power even when justice seems impossible." The letter wasn't signed, but the handwriting was distinctive, precise, elegant, the script of someone with extensive education and practice in formal writing. The school's administrator, a freedman named Benjamin Smalls who'd learned to read during the war, kept the letter. Years later, his grandson would donate it to the Beaufort County Historical Society, where a researcher would eventually notice its similarity to the handwriting in the letter sent to the Charleston Mercury in 1849. But the full truth remained scattered across archives and memories, pieces of a puzzle that no one had assembled completely, until events beginning in 1883 finally brought various threads together. That year, a construction crew renovating the basement of the old Beaufort courthouse made a discovery that would shake the careful silence maintained for 35 years. Behind a false wall in the records room, a wall that appeared original but was actually added sometime around 1850, as later investigation would reveal, they found a locked metal box. Inside were documents that had been deliberately hidden, not misplaced or lost through bureaucratic confusion, but intentionally concealed by someone with access to the courthouse's most secure spaces. The box contained correspondence between Judge Rutledge and 3 other circuit judges in South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. The letters, dating from 1839 to 1847, discussed what they called the population control problem in careful, clinical language that didn't quite disguise the horror of what they were planning. A letter from the Georgia judge, dated April 1842, noted, "The procedure you have perfected could prove invaluable if implemented systematically across our region. Imagine the cost savings if we need not feed and clothe children from birth until they reach working age, a period of 12 to 14 years during which they consume resources but produce little. Imagine the control we would maintain if reproduction occurred only by our permission when economic conditions warranted. Your technique offers a solution to the South's greatest economic challenge, how to maintain an enslaved labor force without the burden of supporting unproductive dependents." Judge Rutledge's response, preserved in his careful script, was chilling in its rationality. "I have now performed 62 operations with improving success rates. The mortality rate has decreased to approximately 1 in 8, which I believe is acceptable given the benefits achieved. I believe within 2 years we could standardize the technique sufficiently for broader application. My sons are learning quickly. Thomas shows particular aptitude. We could establish training seminars for interested physicians across the South. The initial investment would be minimal, the long-term savings substantial. The implications were staggering. This hadn't been one man's monstrous hobby, but the foundation of a coordinated program spanning multiple states. If Isaac hadn't acted when he did, forced sterilization might have become standard practice throughout the South, hidden under medical language and economic justification. The construction crew foreman, a Union Army veteran named Patrick Donnelly, recognized immediately that these documents were explosive. He took them directly to the Beaufort Tribune, now run by a former slave named Abraham Wallace. Wallace read them and understood he faced the same impossible choice that had confronted others decades earlier: publish and inflame tensions in an already volatile Reconstruction era, or suppress evidence that validated generations of whispered stories. Unlike his predecessors, Wallace chose disclosure. He published a carefully worded article on December 12, 1883, acknowledging the document's existence and summarizing their contents. The headline read, "Courthouse Records Reveal Systematic Crimes Against Enslaved Women." The reaction split predictably along racial lines. Black communities saw validation of horrors long suspected. White residents dismissed it as propaganda. Threats arrived at the Tribune's offices. Then, within a week, someone broke in and stole the documents. The courthouse denied they'd ever existed. The construction foreman received anonymous payment and left South Carolina. Only Wallace's article remained as evidence. The truth would have died again, except for Margaret Finley, a researcher from Fisk University who arrived in Beaufort in 1922. She'd heard fragments from elderly, formerly enslaved people and spent 3 months in archives, assembling pieces. Wallace's article, Crenshaw's 1848 letter, finally discovered in uncatalogued materials, Hathaway's journals, and crucially, Harrison Pettigrew's daughter, revealing her father's hidden documents at the Charleston Historical Society. In 1924, Finley published her findings in the Journal of Negro History. She documented everything: 62 forced sterilizations, 12 deaths, the conspiracy of silence, Isaac's careful justice. Her final paragraph stated, "Isaac's actions were brutal and illegal, yet they occurred within systematic brutality that defies conventional moral judgment. He maimed 6 men who had sterilized 62 women, killed 12, and planned statewide expansion. He used their techniques against them, giving them understanding of what they'd inflicted. History may not pardon him, but neither can it condemn him without also condemning those who chose silence over justice." Finley never found definitive proof of Isaac's fate after 1848. The 1877 Beaufort visitor might have been him at 65, or someone else who knew the story. What she discovered through Philadelphia property records was more suggestive. Between 1865 and 1902, an anonymous donor funded education for 42 young black women from the South Carolina Lowcountry, many descended from families enslaved near Beaufort. Each received notes encouraging them to study medicine, law, or accounting, professions that give you power to read the truth others try to hide. The payments ceased in 1902, suggesting the donor died around then. If it was Isaac, he would have been 90, a long life for someone who'd endured and done what he had. Fairhaven burned in 1931, probably arson. The site became a nature preserve, foundations barely visible under vegetation. A small marker notes it was a significant plantation in the antebellum period, with no mention of what happened there. The story exists now in fragments: archived letters, oral histories, newspaper clippings, academic articles few people read. Most who learn it struggle with impossible questions about justice, vengeance, and morality within immoral systems. Perhaps most haunting is what Isaac reportedly wrote in his destroyed journal, preserved in the memory of a house slave who glimpsed it before burning. They called what they did science. They called it necessary. They never called it by its true name: torture of the helpless for profit and pride. I call what I did justice. Future generations may call it vengeance. Both would be right. Both would be wrong. There are no right words for what happens when evil reaches a point where silence becomes complicity. The question echoes across nearly 2 centuries. What should we call what Isaac did that May night in 1848? What should we call the silence that followed? What should we call a justice system that couldn't acknowledge crimes because doing so would threaten social order? What should we call a community that chose stability over truth? What do you think of this story? Do you believe Isaac was right, or does justice have limits even facing such atrocity? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story affected you, if it made you think about dark corners of American history we rarely examine, hit that like button and share this video with someone unafraid to confront uncomfortable truths. Subscribe and turn on notifications because history's darkest secrets deserve to be told, especially when they make us question everything we thought we knew about right and wrong. See you in the next video.